Welcome to the Property Elite podcast. I'll be your host, Jen Lehman, chartered surveyor and co-founder of Property Elite. Stay tuned each week for more on industry hot topics, market updates and new RICS guidance. In this week's podcast, I look at cavity wall insulation, CWI in residential property. It'll be really interesting reading for residential pathway candidates of inspection and or building pathology as technical competencies. So to start, a brief history of walls. To understand the use of cavity wall insulation, we first need to look at the history of walls. Before the 1920s, most walls were built of solid walls of brick or stone. From the 20s onwards, cavity walls became increasingly used as a way to prevent water ingress and subsequent damp issues in buildings. Cavity walls generally measure at least 260 millimetres in width. You can also generally tell the difference between a solid and a cavity wall by the brickwork pattern. In a cavity wall, you're likely to only see the stretcher, long face of the bricks, whereas in a solid wall, you're likely to see both the stretcher and header, short faces. There are exceptions to this rule, of course, particularly if a non-traditional form of construction has been used. The two brick skins on either side of the cavity are tied together with metal wall ties, which today are made of corrosion-resistant stainless steel. We'll discuss wall tie corrosion in a future blog article, however. Early cavity walls were fairly narrow, with a cavity gap of say 50 mm, and didn't have any insulation between the inner and outer brick skins. From the 1970s onwards, cavity wall insulation became standard, and the internal cavity itself became wider, up to say about 300 mm, with Part L of the building regulations setting specific U values. The purpose of cavity wall insulation is therefore to improve thermal performance and stop heat escaping from inside a dwelling. In new buildings, cavity walls can be insulated with insulation boards or mineral wool bats that sit between the two brick skins. The cavity may be partially or fully filled depending on the type of insulation used. In older buildings with unfilled cavity walls, i.e. where there is no insulating material in the cavity, however, it would not be physically possible to retrofit boards or bats into the cavity. One solution would be to externally insulate the walls, and though in this article we are going to focus on blown cavity wall insulation, i.e. within the cavity. Where cavity wall insulation is retrofitted, the masonry needs to be in good condition and the cavity generally needs to be at least 35 mm, although this may be wider depending on the type of insulation specified. A borescope inspection through a hole drilled in the mortar will establish the cavity dimensions and whether it is clear of rubble and debris. Blown cavity wall insulation is installed by small 22 to 25 mm holes being drilled into the mortar externally at regular intervals of about 1 metre. Small polystyrene beads are then blown into the cavity and the holes refilled with a colour-matched mortar to restore the integrity of the external skin. This allows the beads to fill hard-to-reach areas of the cavity without the need for working at height or for extensive drilling to be undertaken. However, there are a number of building defects that can be caused by blown cavity wall insulation. This is typically the case where the brickwork is in poor condition, such as poor pointing, small bricks or cracking, or the insulation is installed inadequately or incorrectly. This can lead to water penetration through the cavity and subsequent internal excessive moisture. There may also be cold spots internally if the insulation beads were not distributed evenly throughout the cavity, or if the cavity was not sealed at the top before installation took place. It's always recommended to instruct a reputable installer, such as a contractor registered with Cavity Insulation Guarantee Agency, which applies for 25 years. Any installation should also follow the best practice guidance in BRE Good Building Guide 44, Part 2, Insulating Masonry Cavity Walls, Principal Risks and Guidance. Foam is another alternative material that can be used. Modern spray polyurethane foam can be used, although we've already covered its use in another blog and podcast. It's different to urea formaldehyde UF foam, which was injected into many cavity walls as a form of cavity wall insulation during the 70s and 80s. Over time, UF foam degrades and can slump to the bottom of the cavity, as well as being a health hazard and potential carcinogen. Thanks for listening to the Property Elite podcast this week. Head to our website to check out our full blog, free and paid support resources and services, free consultation for every single RICS APC and ASOC RICS candidate, and also ask us any questions you have via the website chat blog. See you next week.